Hey, well, welcome to Compassion Matters, a podcast of the Passional Church Collective. We focus on nurturing compassion-centered, trauma-informed leaders and communities. What is compassion? Why does it matter? As a concept, compassion is kind of complicated. It's not easy to define, but you definitely know it when you see it, and you definitely know it when you don't see it. So in this podcast, when I say compassion, I mean a sensitivity to suffering in self and others with a commitment to alleviate and prevent it, which is kind of the widely prevailing acceptable definition in psychology and sociology. I'm Michael Adam Beck. I'm a professor. I'm a pastor. I'm an author. I coach. I consult. And I'm really passionate about the intersection of theology and sociology. And I believe that the cultivation of compassionate communities can help heal a world that's experiencing an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. So join us as we explore matters of compassion and compassion becoming matter, anything that has mass and takes up space. And we'll engage research of experts and practitioners. In each episode, I try to pair up a theological concept with a sociological concept, or I'll put a theologian in conversation with a sociologist and see really what we can learn from that intersection. In this episode, we're going to dive into a theology of the Incarnation, as I am currently recording this on Christmas Eve and going into the Christmas season. But the Incarnation really is a fancy word to talk about the idea that God became flesh and dwelt among us. And we'll put this in conversation with the lens of Emil Durkheim's theory of social integration. Durkheim believed that strong communities are essential for preventing anomie or social isolation and for fostering a sense of belonging. So as we reflect on the Christmas story, the Incarnation offers a profound answer to the epidemic of loneliness that so many people are experiencing today. And we'll explore how the presence of God in the world, God with us, is not just a theological concept, but it's a call to cultivate communities that embody connection and healing and solidarity. And I'm also going to be kind of leaking out some ideas from my forthcoming book. Will come out in February, Never Alone, Sharing the Gift of Community in a Lonely World, and kind of sharing some of the key ideas that are coming out of that book. So jump in with me as we uncover how these ancient theological truths align with modern sociological insights to offer really a powerful antidote to the loneliness that plagues our world today. My little brother died of a broken heart. I can remember sitting beside him in the hospital bed, holding his hand, watching the machines kind of pump air into him, and the um, dialysis machine was circulating fluids into his body 24 hours a day. So essentially he was deceased, but he had these machines keeping him alive. And as the only living relative that could make this decision, as his older brother, I was the one who had to, sign the papers to take him off life support. I can remember the struggle that I had, one, just losing my little brother to this horrible disease of addiction, and two, if I'm honest, I had an internal struggle going on spiritually, theologically, and I remember just kind of holding his hand and stroking the teardrops that are tattooed beneath his eyes, and um, saying goodbye to my little brother, basically. So, I had to make that gut-wrenching decision to take him off life support. I don't wish that decision on any person, for your family member, your sibling, your parent, your child. I've done it before, actually, as a child with my adopted mama. But um, the fatal diagnosis for my little brother is overdose, right? And we're in an overdose epidemic. 100,000 people die every year of overdose. But the underlying condition was loneliness. The isolation that gripped McKinley's soul over the too few years of his short, hard life. McKinley actually died just days after his 34th birthday. And 2 months earlier, he had just gotten out of prison. He did a 10-year prison sentence. We were both poor growing up. We didn't have parents. We were in and out of juvenile detention, um, running around in the streets. And because we didn't have legal representation in Florida is a hardcore, we direct file juveniles as adults, and we give max penalties for things. And McKinley got the max penalty, did 10 years in prison. And as a pastor at that time, and I had been in long-term recovery myself, I had prepared for his return. I had resources. My church at Wildwood, we turned into a sober housing program. We let a group called House of Hope move into our buildings, and so our church was very integrated with recovery and meetings and literally housing men in recovery. But instead of taking those resources, McKinley chose to return to old habits, old friends, his old work. And within 2 months of that, he was gone. 2 months, 10 years in prison, spent most of his life incarcerated or in prison, between juvenile and jail and prison. 2 months, freedom, and dead. So in those final moments beside my brother, I was consumed with anxiety by the thought of his eternal destiny. Had he found peace with God? For any Christian, that's something cycling in our minds, our hearts, with a loved one who's in this situation. And the toxic theology I was formed in painted a picture of an unforgiving, transactional God. It was a belief system that suggested unless you confess the right magical formula, at just the right moment before you died, there was no hope for mercy. You were damned to eternal torment in hell. And that's really a theology that's steeped in fear, fear of judgment, fear of everlasting punishment, and really the sense that God was distant and disinterested in the real struggles of human beings, or that God doesn't see the whole picture of our life, or the wounds that deform us, or the trauma of abandonment that McKinley and I experienced, or the abuse, and that God would somehow be oblivious to all those things. It's really a one-dimensional transactional view of salvation, this distant God punishing the hell out of Jesus on our behalf, this divine child abuse theology, so that we could, go to heaven, and as long as we pray that sinner's prayer. And this is overly simplistic so-called good news, and it just felt out of touch for me, the realities of my own life and the realities of people I minister to. It does not align with the compassionate, inclusive nature of Jesus' ministry, which is a snapshot, a window into the nature and character and heart of God. But this was the kind of theology that haunted me in that hospital room, and it's the theology that so many of us have been formed in, right? And as the machine stopped, I watched McKinley's life slip away. And I thought, was it possible for someone who had lived a life of abandonment and rebellion and rejection to enter into the arms of a loving God? And he and I had lots of conversations about this while he was incarcerated. And was there room for grace for a soul whose last days seemed to reject what Christ was offering? And so in the days leading up to his death, I received a vision from Jesus. And I don't want to freak people out, but I believe that Jesus communicates to us through visions and prayers and the biblical word in the book of Acts, exkatos, these kind of ecstatic, prayerful kind of visions that come through prayer. And that vision actually shifted something within me. And the peace that permeated my decision at that time was not just this temporary comfort. It was this profound awakening to a more loving, expansive understanding of God's grace. And I began to realize that God's grace is not confined to the boundaries we create through dogma and doctrines. The river rapids of God's love do not suddenly run dry in the moment of death. They carry us over this waterfall, right, into a depth of God's love that we cannot comprehend on this side of eternity. And God's grace is bigger and wider and more deeply rooted in compassion than we could ever actually imagine. So, besides the true good news is not just a future promise of heaven, an escape hatch from some eternal bummer of a postmortem destiny, right? It is meant to transform our present reality. It's about communal life and unity in Christ right here and now, the eternal life now that Jesus talked about. If you follow him, a life that happens in the midst of the ordinary. It's the invitation to embrace wholeness and be together in the present and living as a reflection of God's original unity with all of creation. So, this is what Christians mean when we celebrate the incarnation in this Christmas season. The word incarnation comes from the Latin incarnationem, incarnationem, or the act of being made flesh, or originally, more crudely, you could say a piece of meat, right? The heart of that Latin word is carne. Think like carne asada steak, right? Or the God who became a piece of meat is basically the kind of literal translation of incarnation. And compassion is the sensitivity to suffering in self and others with a commitment to alleviate and prevent it. And matter, anything that has mass or takes up space, compassion matterized, right? Took on molecular particle mass reality. Or, we sing those songs, Love Came Down at Christmas, right? And that's really what we're saying. All the way down into our mess and the living hells that we create to rescue us from ourselves. So the vision of McKinley, I saw him as a little boy just walking hand in hand with Jesus through a garden, whole and healed and smiling. All his scars were gone. And that was not just a vision of peace for me, but a reflection of a truth that ran deeper than any theological construct. All the intellectual stuff was kind of stripped away, and it was just a moment of pure being and revelation. And that prayerful moment of communion was for me a regrounding in the hyper real foundation of God's graceful witness. That's witness, not witness. That's not a mispronunciation. God's witness. And I realized McKinley was not alone in that hospital bed, and neither was I. And God's grace permeated that space in a way I'd never experienced. And that while McKinley was laying there, essentially for all intents and purposes, kind of brain dead, that him and Jesus were having a long conversation in that hospital bed. And I now believe that grace has no expiration date. Grace woos and pursues and puts on flesh to get to us in this life and continues that effort in the next. And even in the moments where it seems like someone has fallen too far or is too broken, God's love reaches further. And in the midst of McKinley's death, I saw a glimpse of the God I had always hoped existed, a God who embraced the broken, who descends into the depths of our living hell, who never lets go of anyone, not even in our darkest moments. A God for whom there is grace, even for that convicted criminal that was nailed to the cross besides Jesus. Remember the story from Luke 23? A man who was taken from the writhing torture of a slow, humiliating death into God's eternal love with a last gasping confession in the final moments of his life. Do you remember Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise"? Indeed, there's a power in realizing that God's love cannot be boxed in by the rigid doctrines we create or the artificial timeline of mortality. God's love is unconditional and accessible even when our theology tells us otherwise. And there's a struggle going on there with that compassion brain and the vagus nerve and what I've talked about, like the old core part in that prefrontal cortex where our toxic theology prevents love and grace and compassion. Now, I'm not a newcomer to stories like McKinley's. For years, Jill and I have been walking alongside individuals facing the darkness of addiction, mental health struggles, trauma. We did this at Wildwood, where we turned the church basically into kind of a inpatient rehab and really kind of centered ministry there around recovery. And at St. Mark's, where we currently serve, and Compassion, the church that we're planning in Ocala, Florida, we house a holistic inpatient recovery program called Open Arms Village, or OAV. So our ministry is grounded in the belief that healing comes through the graceful gift of community. And St. Mark's is a space of incarnation where worship, recovery, and support intersect to offer hope made flesh to those who've been abandoned or neglected by the church or society. Jill and I pray that God sends us to the churches no one else wants or sees. And at OAV, men and women in recovery live in the same space where we hold Bible studies and committee meetings and worship services. We have a mental health services, counseling on site, what used to be the pastor's office. We have multiple buildings on the campus that are now recovery clubhouses for the 12-step fellowships, multiple 12-step fellowships. Then we turned the parsonage into a step-up house, where they get to a certain point from OAV, they can go live in the step-up house. So all that's going on right there and in the church, like literally in the building and on the property. So this incarnational community fosters connection and accountability, and it provides not only a safe place to live, but really a sanctuary for growth and healing and spiritual restoration for the residents. And we're committed to being a consistent presence in the lives of those who feel like they've hit rock bottom, offering them the love and dignity they deserve as they journey toward healing. It's a ministry built on the understanding that no one, absolutely no one, is beyond redemption, and that the power of communal life in Jesus can bring light into the darkest places. So healing takes place not just through words, but through shared experiences, relationships, and the grace we encounter in one another. It's a place where people are seen, known, loved, find belonging as they walk through their journey toward recovery and wholeness one day at a time. It's like an island of belonging in a sea of isolation. And the realization of the unlimited nature of God's grace has become foundational in our blended ecology of church, where Fresh Expressions gather in tattoo parlors and burrito joints and the local substance abuse rehab. Last night we were in the rehab here in Ocala. We do a Fresh Expression called Higher Power Hour, and we were talking about Christmas and incarnation and where we found God in unexpected places at different times in our life. And we heard miraculous testimonies of God preventing someone from dying from overdose, for people who miraculously were brought through a situation or received a favorable sentence where they should have went to prison but got sent to a rehab. Just one story after another, how God was at work and the power of incarnational community. And that's one of our Fresh Expressions we do every week. And I just believe the real work of ministry happens when we step outside the comfortable spaces of our doctrinal certainty and meet people where they are, broken, hurting, and needing grace people like all of us are. And in our shared brokenness, we actually find the infinite capacity of God's love, a love that refuses to let anyone be abandoned, even when the world would leave them to die. So yes, technically, McKinley overdosed. But in reality, he jammed a needle in his arm to escape the aching isolation. And unfortunately, McKinley's story is not unique. It is the heartbreaking reality of a crisis that's too often hidden, the epidemic of loneliness. And that's an epidemic, by the way, that claims hundreds of thousands of lives every year. And Jesus' incarnation, his coming to be with us, to live among us, and to ultimately heal the brokenhearted, right? Luke 4, I came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim good news to the poor, to set the captives free, all of that offers a deep and eternal antidote to the loneliness that claims so many lives every day. So amid my own grief, the promise of Emmanuel, whose name literally means God with us, right, became so real. And for McKinley, for me, and for all of us, God is never far away. God's love, always near, always present, offers the community of togetherness we so desperately need. So this Christmas, as we remember the birth of Jesus, the one who came to heal the lonely and brokenhearted, I'm drawn to reflect on a world that continues to be ravaged by isolation. And Jesus, in his very incarnation, embraced humanity in its deepest sufferings and offers us the ultimate gift of community. So let's explore what Durkheim can contribute to this conversation. Let's move to sociology for a moment. Emile Durkheim, he lived in the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and he was a French sociologist. And he's often regarded as one of the founding figures of sociology. He focused on the ways in which social structures and institutions shape individual behavior and contribute to social cohesion. And in fact, many believe Durkheim was really the first to kind of help sociology become a science. And his work laid the foundation for understanding society as more than just a collection of individuals. He argued that society has its own reality and its own social facts, is the term that he used. And these were patterns of behavior and beliefs and values that exist outside the individual and exert influence over our actions. So those social facts actually could be studied in a scientific way through different methodologies and research methods. And so Durkheim was particularly interested in how societies maintain order and stability, especially in the face of rapid social change, which there was a level of that in his own time. And his contributions to sociology were instrumental in establishing it as the scientific discipline that it is today, and especially through his methodological approach, which sought to understand social phenomenon through empirical research. So we still, as sociologists, employ many of those methods that originated with Durkheim. And his focus, he focused on religion quite a bit, which was central to his sociological theories. In fact, if you look at his work, like The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which was 1912, Durkheim examined religion as a key social institution that plays an essential role in the functioning of society. So he didn't really study religion in the like spiritual or supernatural kind of aspect of things, but as a science, studied how religion functions. And he argued that religion serves as a social force that helps to reinforce social cohesion and social solidarity. So Durkheim believed that religious practices and beliefs are not merely a reflection of an individual's spiritual needs, but rather they are a reflection of collective social values. So through rituals and symbols and sacred beliefs, religion fosters a sense of belonging and unity among individuals within a society. My colleagues and I at the University of Florida just did some actual research using Durkheim's kind of frameworks, studying some religious groups in a study we called Rituals of Belonging. So looking at, does participation in a religious group and those rituals that create solidarity and community, does that create greater social well-being than people that do not participate in religious groups or have those kind of rituals? So for Durkheim, religion's primary function was to create and maintain that social order, and by binding individuals together in a collective consciousness, ensuring stability and preventing societal breakdown. So he saw religious rituals as mechanisms for expressing and reinforcing the values of the community. And he posited that religion, in its essence, is a social institution that reinforces collective morality and serves as a powerful force for social cohesion and community. There's a phrase that's been attributed to him that we don't really have it written down, but it kind of summarizes his thinking that that religion kind of provides the compass for kind of the ship of society. That a society without religion is like trying to make a journey on a ship with no compass, and we just kind of get lost and circle around. And this is a completely secular assessment that he gave us. But Emile Durkheim's theory of social integration of the role of community in preventing anomie is really important here. So Durkheim had a foundational concept about social cohesion and how community plays a critical role in human well-being. And when individuals are disconnected or isolated, they're likely to experience anomie, which is a state, and that, by the way, that's ANOMIE for our listeners, anomie. And it's a state of normlessness or disconnection from society. It's when kind of the gears of society kind of go off the rails, break. There's a break with paradigms. There's a disconnect societally, and the lack of integration that results from that, when there's not a supportive social structure, can lead to profound feelings of isolation and despair and even suicidal tendencies. So he actually studied that, right? One of his big studies was to look at Catholic and Protestant suicide rates and study that in a scientific way and look at the differences there. And anomie was a kind of a central concept that came out of that research. So Durkheim's insights on how modern society, with its increasing individualism and the breakdown of traditional community bonds, contributes to alienation, adds a depth to our understanding of the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, right? Durkheim emphasized that social support networks, such as religious communities or family groups, are essential to prevent the sense of disconnection that leads to such struggles. And so Vivek Murthy's report last year, the 2023 Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, draws on some of these ideas and makes a case that the decline of religious affiliation and declines of levels of religiosity actually do aggravate and maybe even cause or lead to increased social isolation, the epidemic of loneliness, and all of that. So if we incorporate Durkheim's theory, think about what's happening at like a place like Open Arms Village, right? And the importance of incarnational community that directly counteracts the alienation that can lead to destructive behaviors. So that emphasis on God's love that we focus on in the incarnation and being present in the brokenness with people mirrors Durkheim's idea that communities must be sources of emotional and social support to avoid isolation, providing a sociological framework that underscores the healing power of connectedness. So that whole theory really aligns with the point that loneliness or enemy can lead to tragic outcomes, and how God's grace manifested through supportive communities, the gift of communal life in Jesus, serve as a profound antidote to the isolation that grips many people in society today. So let's go back to the Christmas message and wrap this up here. The Christmas, I love my share of cute nativity plays and candlelight services. I'm going to do one tonight, by the way. It'll be a little different, and it will also have an all-night alcathon where people can come in and sit in silence and pray in the sanctuary all night. But this Christmas is more than our little plays and our services. When we consider this refugee infant born in a feeding trough, like in the garage, because there was no room, in the main space, a garage that smelled like animal shit, where animals were kept, and a feeding trough, a manger is where animals eat out of, right? That Jesus came to create witness and community through that. Christmas is about the arrival of God with us in the midst of our loneliness, our brokenness, and our fears. And those angels declared to shepherds, by the way, the non-social influencers with no followers, no social media platform, no socioeconomic status, these kind of nobodies in the ancient world. They got the message, right? Of good news, of great joy for all people. Luke 10:2 there. And this joy, this good news is not for some people, not for just some of the people, but for all of us. And especially for those who feel unseen and unheard and unloved. The message of Christmas is about the one who came to be with us. Witness. Not in a faraway heaven, but here in our suffering, in our struggles, in our deepest places of isolation. And the church is the continued embodiment of this incarnational gift. Communal life in Jesus is the ultimate Christmas gift that can heal our isolation and our loneliness. So, as we move through this season, let's remember that the coming of Christ was not only about salvation from sin, but also about the salvation from loneliness. In fact, I'm actually convinced, and I make a case for this and Never Alone, that the words sin and isolation can be used interchangeably. Sin's not just about our moral failures, and it's really not just about the social structures of sin that perpetuate and misshape people for sin, but the deep separation we experience from ourselves, others, and God is sin. Isolation is part of sin. It is the fallout of sin. The first not good that we get in the Bible, it is not good for human beings to be alone. And then that fragmenting of relationships, isolation is sin, and sin is isolation. And so the Christian journey unfolds in these three movements: original goodness, that in that awakening to our inherent belovedness there, that original trauma, the process of healing from the fragmentation of sin to religament, the heart of the word for religio or religion, to religament together with God and true self, and the original unity that Thomas Merton talks about, which I dive into in the book, which is the realization that we are already one, living in shared communion with each other and all of creation, the oneness that we already are, Merton called it. So these movements show that we're not meant to be isolated, but we're meant to experience the fullness of life together, both with God and one another. And the incarnation is about how God heals our isolation. God did not wait for us to clean ourselves up to be worthy. Jesus entered into our world vulnerable, humble, and powerless, so that we could always know that God is with us, that we are never actually alone. And in Jesus, we find the perfect example of solidarity, the kind that heals. Just as Jesus walked with the lonely, the broken, and the marginalized, we too are called to walk alongside one another and to be the body of Christ, literally the communal embodiment of communal life in Jesus in a fragmented society. With all her blemishes and all her beauty marks, the church is God's gift to the world, a healing community that cures our isolation and loneliness. So I wrote Never Alone really to tell every McKinley story. I suspect you have a McKinley in your life as well. I wanted to keep his memory alive and to keep his death to utilize as a vehicle of healing for others. And in the midst of an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, the book really offers a practical guide for how every believer can cultivate fresh expressions of church that heal, that cure us of our loneliness and isolation, that form in the everyday spaces and rhythm and places of life. And so I'm doing a series on the Substack right now on Never Alone. And this is kind of the opener, and I'll be sharing key insights from the book leading up to its release on February 18th, 2025. So follow with me on that journey. And let's remember that this Christmas, we're never alone, and that together, through the love of Jesus, through the grace of Jesus, the unlimited, wooing, pursuing ocean, river, rapids of God's grace, we are made whole. And may we, like Jesus, cultivate incarnational community for the lonely, the hurting, and the brokenhearted. And in doing so, reflect the true meaning of the incarnation, about a God with us, Emmanuel. Hey, thanks for listening to the Compassion Matters podcast. If the episode resonated with you and added a bit more compassion to your life, please take a moment to subscribe, share it with a friend, leave a review. We'd love to hear how you're engaging with the concepts of incarnational community and healing loneliness in your own life. And if you want to dive deeper, follow the link to the Substack. There's a whole article on this. And to connect with us or learn more about the Passional Church movement, check out PassioDei.com. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can pre-order Never Alone on any kind of normal bookstore process, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all of the places where you can get books. You can pre-order Never Alone. Hey, compassion matterized. Let's make it matter. And we'll see you next time on Compassion Matters.